Take a moment now to settle into stillness. Let your body sink softly into the mattress, like a feather drifting down, into a pool of warm candlelight. Feel the gentle hush of night wrapping around you like a woolen cloak, soft, comforting, with each breath becoming slower, quieter, easier. There's nothing you need to do now, nothing at all to solve or remember, just the quiet, the softness of the dark, and the sound of my voice gently guiding you. Let your eyes become heavy, even if they remain open, and feel the tension melt from your jaw, your neck, your shoulders. Let it all fall away. The day is over now. There is nothing left to hold. Breathe in once more, slowly, deeply, and exhale like the last flicker of a candle's flame, quiet and calm, because our story tonight takes us far, far back in time, to a place where oil lamps burn low, where cobbled roads wind through silent villages, and the line between life and death was uncertain. Our story tonight begins in a small, damp village, nestled in the shadow of a great wooded hill, sometime in the 14th century, a place without doctors, without clocks, without certainty. The air is thick with the scent of peat smoke and early autumn rot, apples browning on the ground, the musky perfume of damp hay and moss. Chickens scratch the dirt with feathered feet, and in the distance a bell tolls slow and hollow. You are a villager. You wake before dawn each day, tending to the hearth and the sour-smelling stew pot, patching clothes and lighting tallow candles with shaking fingers. The days are quiet, but the nights are quieter still. This is a time when illness arrives with the evening fog, one breath too many in the chill, and your neighbor is coughing up black bile by morning. People don't speak the word plague, but they feel it in their bones. There is no healer, no medicine, only superstition and whispered prayers, and death comes so often it is not feared, only expected. But sometimes death comes, almost. You've heard the stories passed in hushed voices by the fire when children are thought to be sleeping. Tales of the buried who were not truly gone. Sometimes it began with a fever, a terrible bone-melting heat that left the sufferer unmoving, unbreathing, still as marble. No heartbeat that could be heard, eyes glassy, skin pale. To the frightened family, it meant one thing, or the gravedigger. They came with carts, always at dusk. The gravedigger never removed his hood, and his fingers were always smudged with earth. He didn't ask questions. He just nodded, covered the body in a linen shroud, and wheeled it to the edge of the churchyard, where plots were dug by lamplight. And that might have been the end for most, but not always. Some say the first moan was heard by a sexton locking the chapel gates, a groan, faint, from beneath the soil. Others say it was the priest checking on a newly laid grave at sunrise, who found the fresh mound collapsed inward mud clawed open, a broken fingernail on the grass. Word spread. Stories emerged from across the countryside. When the dead were exhumed months later, some were found turned over in their coffins, arms lifted, faces frozen in twisted, silent screams. The wooden lid bore scratches, deep ones. And then something changed. Families began tying a string to the wrist of the deceased, leading it up through the coffin lid, through the earth, and attaching it to a small bell mounted above the grave. They called it a safety bell, and beside every such grave sat a watchman. At night, When the fog hung low like breath on the ground, he would sit silently by the bell, sometimes with a pipe, sometimes a prayer, always waiting. If it rang, he would dig. You were chosen for this task once, just once. The grave belonged to a weaver's wife, thin, pale, and mute for the last 2 years of her life. When she passed, the family could not afford a proper coffin. Only a wooden box nailed hastily together, with the bell string wound gently around her wrist. You remember the night well. A chill that seemed to rise not from the sky, but from the earth. Dampness clung to your boots. You wrapped your cloak tight and lit a single candle, placing it on the stone beside the grave. The bell hung above her like a warning. The graveyard was quiet. The trees beyond the chapel swayed only slightly. An owl hooted once, then was still. You waited. An hour passed, then another. Your candle burned low. You grew sleepy, and then it happened. A soft clink. So soft you might have imagined it. But then again, clink, clink. The bell was moving, ever so gently, as though tugged by the weak hand of someone who could barely remember what it meant to ring. Your blood ran cold. You stared at the bell as it rocked again, slightly harder, and you remembered the gravedigger's words, once muttered in ale-induced half-sleep at the tavern. If it rings, dig fast. The air runs out quicker than you think. Your hands trembled as you grabbed the spade. You began to dig. Your fingers were already numb, though whether from fear or the chill, you couldn't say. The shovel met resistance. Quickly shallow graves were common. Earth loosened by recent rains turned heavy and wet, sticking to the blade with every lift. The bell had stopped ringing, but you couldn't stop now. You dug faster. With every strike of the spade, your breath came shorter, louder, and misted into the cold air. The candle flickered wildly behind you, as if disturbed by something more than wind. And beneath your feet, something shifted. The wooden lid was close. Another shovelful, and then another. The edge of a box peeked through the dirt. And then you saw it clearly, rough-hewn, wet, the wood already splintering at the seams. You dropped to your knees and began clawing at the soil, with your hands frantic, fingers scraping bark and worm-soft mud, until you could reach the edges of the lid. You pressed your ear to it. Silence, not even breath. You hesitated. Then, with the iron tip of the shovel, you wedged under the lid and pried upward. It took all your strength. When the lid cracked open, you expected screaming. Instead, you heard only the sharp inhale of someone who had been holding their breath for far, far too long. The weaver's wife opened her eyes, milky, sunken, but moving, alive. You pulled her upward, arms weak, clothing soaked and clinging to her like burial wrappings. Her fingers trembled. Her lips were blue, and yet she lived. She would never speak again. But she lived. Word of the bell spread. From that day on, every grave in your village, every single one, had a bell. Sometimes they rang. Sometimes they didn't. But there was never again a night when the graveyard was left unwatched. And you were known from then on as the one who dug her out. It became your quiet trade, silent, lonely, but necessary. The villagers never thanked you, not openly, but when you passed, they tipped their hats, left food at your door, and when your time came, years later, you were given your own bell, strung with care just in case. But your story isn't the only one. Throughout medieval Europe, there were dozens, hundreds of accounts whispered between townsfolk, stories of the shrouded breathers, the earth sleepers. In some villages in what is now Poland, coffins were nailed shut with stone slabs placed over the chest to prevent the dead from rising, not from fear of mistakes, but from fear of undead return. They called them revenants. In parts of eastern Germany, corpses were sometimes buried face down, so that if they awoke and tried to claw their way out, they would only dig deeper into the earth. Superstition or caution? And then there were the bells. By the 18th century, the idea of safety coffins had spread far beyond village lore. Inventors began designing elaborate contraptions coffins with breathing tubes, glass viewing panes, and alarm systems. Some even installed ladders should the buried be strong enough to climb out themselves. In 1822, a German priest named P.G. Pessler wrote in detail about burial-induced trauma, citing dozens of cases where the so-called dead revived moments or hours after entombment. But these ideas were not born from science. They were born from fear. A fear so old and deep it thrummed beneath the soil like a heartbeat, because the grave, in the medieval mind, was not always final. Death was uncertain. Doctors were few. Superstition was many. And in the quiet hours of the night, when the fog rolled thick across churchyards and moss, climbed the feet of stone angels, villagers listened to the bells. Not all rang, of course, but the fear was never that they would. The fear was that they wouldn't, that someone below, still warm, still faintly alive, might be too weak to ring at all, that they would fade away in silence, under earth, unseen, unheard. And that is the fear that truly lingered. Not ghosts, not curses, but the silence of being forgotten underground. So they listened, and they waited, night after night, wrapped in wool, sipping ale by lantern light, hands resting on the handles of shovels, waiting for the faintest ring of a bell. Even now, some old cemeteries still have them, iron rods with bell cradles rusted with time, nearly hidden by ivy and thorns. Forgotten relics of a time when people feared being buried more than being dead. And perhaps they weren't wrong, because the line between life and death was thinner than anyone wanted to admit. Even now, in the hush of night, in your soft bed, can you imagine it? The cold weight of the soil above, the scratch of linen against your cheek, the dry, stifling air pressing in with every shallow breath, your heart beating louder than the silence, and somewhere above a string tied to your wrist, leading upward to a little brass bell waiting for you to ring. Breathe in softly now. Let the stillness settle once more. Let your mind drift like a leaf on quiet waters, slow, calm, steady. The flickering torchlight from the village has faded now. You're back in the graveyard, surrounded by crooked stones and lichen-covered crosses. The air carries the scent of wet earth and old iron. It's not frightening here, just still. Very, very still. Tonight we continue where we left off, with you listening for the bell in a world where life could be mistaken for death, and death for sleep. The fear of being buried alive didn't fade, it evolved. And while villagers kept to bells and shovels, nobles sought more elaborate means to delay the grave. There was a famous case recorded in 1385 in northern Italy. A young noblewoman named Serafine collapsed during supper, her skin cold, breath faint, pulse undetectable. Declared dead by the town's clergy, she was laid to rest in the family crypt that evening. But a servant boy swore he heard crying through the stone. They ignored him until the next morning, when one of the guards claimed the crypt's iron door had rattled during the night. When the tomb was opened days later, they found her fingernails cracked and torn, her lips bruised from screaming. No breath remained. From then on, noble families insisted on holding 3-day vigils, watching the dead by candlelight to be sure no breath returned before burial. These became known as waiting periods, often accompanied by prayers, singing, and the burning of rosemary or rue. Even in monasteries, similar customs arose. Monks, in their silence, developed coded systems of breath-checking, laying a mirror beneath the nose, placing a feather near the lips. If no fog, no stir. Only then did they call the grave digger. But mistakes still happened. In one monastery in the Highlands of Scotland, it said a novice monk was placed in a crypt during a harsh winter. The cold had slowed his body so completely that all signs of life vanished. When the thaw came days later, and the monks opened the chamber to add another brother, they found him huddled in the corner, frozen upright in terror. He'd woken, and there had been no bell. This is why bells were not the only safeguard. In some Germanic villages, the bodies were wrapped with paper talismans, prayers written in looping black ink, pinned to the chest or forehead. These were believed to ward off not only spirits, but the fear of returning from death confused and cursed. In medieval Wales, small children were told bedtime stories, not to fear ghosts, but to listen for the bells of the sleepers. That's what they called them, not the dead, the sleepers. And it was seen as a sacred duty to hear them, to wake them. Let that image stay with you a moment. A quiet, foggy churchyard, a moon low over crooked trees, a small brass bell, still as stone, until ding, ding. Someone is calling back. You'd think it would be loud, but it isn't. It's the sound of something desperate, gentle, the barest plea from below the soil. Not rage, not horror, just the soft, slow tap of someone who doesn't understand where they are, or why it's so dark. Let's travel now to a different time. You're in a stone chapel in 15th century Bohemia. The windows are narrow slits, and the floor is covered in crushed straw. You're a watcher tonight, hired not by the church, but by a grieving merchant who lost his only son. His final request was simple: wait 2 nights before the burial. Listen, watch. The body lies in the corner, wrapped in white, arms folded, lips sewn shut. Yes, stitched. A practice among some towns where it was believed a dead body could whisper secrets to the devil. A candle flickers beside you. The wax is nearly gone, and you doze until you hear a breath. Your eyes snap open. You lean in. Nothing. But then the body twitches. Only once, just a hand. You freeze. The air feels thick. Your breath is shallow. A minute passes, then another, and then the eyes open, clouded, but watching you. You whisper his name. He doesn't answer. You fetch the priest, but the priest refuses to believe. They bury him anyway. You never speak of it again, but you always remember. And long after, when your own time comes, you request a bell and a watcher, because you understand now it isn't about fear. It's about dignity. It's about the wish to be heard. one last time. Let your breathing slow again, softer now, like wind over tall grass. Let your thoughts melt away, like wax along the sides of an old iron candle. You are safe here. You are warm. There is only the story now, and the calm that comes when the past begins to whisper, not shout. We drift now gently, deeper into the fog-tinged folds of medieval life, where fear was never far, but always quiet. You are in England now. The year is 1349. The Black Death is beginning its second wave. The streets are empty, the graveyards full, and in one quiet corner of the countryside, a cart makes its slow way down a dirt road, its wheels groaning under the weight of newly claimed dead. The driver does not speak. He wears a mask of layered cloth soaked in vinegar and a wide hat to shield from bad air, or so he believes. Each time the bell of the chapel rings, he stops. Another body, another shallow grave, but today he is late. The sun has already dipped low behind the hills, casting long shadows that stretch like fingers across the earth. He stops beside a farmhouse. A body waits by the door, wrapped neatly, pale and still. The family has left coins for payment and closed all shutters tight. As he lifts the body, he thinks he hears something, a whisper, a sigh. But the wind plays tricks. He loads her into the cart. She is young, a maid, perhaps, or the daughter of a blacksmith. As the cart creaks onward, a slow, rhythmic clinking begins to sound, not loud, but steady. It's the bell, one tied to the wrist of a different body, already buried. He stops, slowly, staring. The bell swings once, twice. He looks around. No one in sight. He leaves the cart, approaches the grave, and kneels. The bell still sways gently, then stills. He sighs. Just wind, he mutters, but as he stands, the cart moves. The girl, she has shifted. Her arm dangles now over the edge, the shroud loose around her shoulders. Her eyes are open. He stares at her for a long, long time. She does not blink, but her breath moves her chest. He runs. The villagers find her the next morning, cold but alive, lying beside the cart. She never speaks again, and she never closes her eyes. You might wonder how often it really happened. How many were buried too soon? Records from the time are vague, inconsistent, frightened. But some entries remain. One Benedictine abbot wrote in Latin of a brother who had been taken by fever and wrapped in cloth, yet on the third day was seen walking confused in the orchard, asking after bread. In 1394, a physician in Burgundy wrote of 3 cases of false passing, where patients entered a death-like trance during fevers, awoke days later, and had no memory of their burial preparations. Even the church began to issue new protocols in some regions, 3 full days of observation, lit candles, clergy in shifts. Still, fear crept in, because it wasn't just about waking. It was about waking alone, beneath soil, in darkness, with no air and no voice loud enough to pierce the ground. The horror wasn't immediate death, it was the slow, quiet descent into it after believing it had already arrived. Let's pause, just for a moment. Let the image settle, of a bell silent, of a string frayed, of a grave newly packed, and footsteps walking away, unaware. Now picture yourself, not as the buried, but as the one who listens, sitting beneath a starlit sky, wrapped in a wool cloak, hands warmed by a clay cup of cider. The grave is before you, the bell above it, and the night is silent, save for the chirp of crickets and the creak of trees swaying gently in the breeze. It is a strange kind of peace, isn't it? Knowing you can listen, knowing you might be needed. There is something noble in it, something quiet, sacred. In the 15th century, a small group of nuns in what is now Austria developed a dedicated bell sisterhood. Their vow was not only of silence, but of vigil. They tended the graveyard of their convent, where all sisters were buried with bells. The nuns rotated watches 2 at a time, each dusk until dawn, listening. They recorded every bell ring. They saved 5 lives over 30 years. One nun, Sister Magdalene, was later canonized in her region, not for miracles, but for presence, for the gift of listening when others would not. That, too, is history, the kind that never makes it into grand tales of kings or wars, but the kind that matters, because in the dark, when breath grows shallow and the body lies still, sometimes all that's left between life and death is someone willing to hear the bell. And tonight, in this story, that someone is you. Let yourself ease deeper now into the softness beneath you. Let your hands grow still, your shoulders melt downward, the way snow melts into stone under the first spring sun. With each breath you drift further into stillness, into quiet. You are not here in this world of rush and noise. You are elsewhere, among worn stones and cool moss in the hushed world of candlelight and slow-moving shadow. You are back in the Middle Ages, but this time not in a village or abbey. You are in the woods, a small, scattered hamlet nestled in a clearing where trees grow tall enough to blot out half the daylight. In this place, burial is not done in churches. The villagers dig their own graves, sometimes too shallow, sometimes too early. You are a child of this place, and you've heard the stories your grandmother told curled beside her hearth while soup boiled slow in the pot and wind tapped on the shutters like long fingers. She spoke of the girl from the next valley over. They said she caught a chill in the spring rains, that her body went still after days of silence. Her family wept, laid her in the earth, planted rosemary at the headstone. But then the bell rang. By the time the men returned to dig, she was gone. The earth torn open from within, nails scattered. No footprints leaving the grave, only drag marks. She was never found. Some said she became a spirit, neither dead nor living. Others said she never died in the first place. And still, at twilight, children say they hear bells echoing from the woods, not the clean, clear chime of brass, but the wet, dull jingle of rusted metal swaying slowly beneath the trees. In some parts of medieval Ireland, it was believed that those who were buried alive returned as sleepwalkers, men and women, who had clawed their way up from shallow graves and wandered the land, confused and speechless, their minds stuck between this world and the next. They called them the Twilighters, not undead, not ghosts, just people, trapped in the in-between. Some were welcomed back, others were burned. In 1411, the town of Kilbarrow recorded the case of a man named Ellis Ray, believed to be dead after a fever and buried by the parish. 4 days later, he was found walking barefoot along the marsh path, clothes torn, eyes unfocused, fingernails black with soil. He could not speak, but he smiled. He lived another 10 years. He never spoke a single word again. In nearby towns, they began tying not just bells, but chalk slates to the inside of coffins. If the buried awoke, they could try to write their names. Only 2 were ever recovered with writing on them. The rest were blank, or scratched through in confusion. You are in one such village now, and you are the bell keeper. Each night you carry your lantern across rows of crooked crosses and handmade markers. You stop at each grave that has a bell 28 in all. You check the chords, the knots, the tension. You test the sway. You press your ear to the iron base of each. Then you sit in the watch house, a small wooden hut with one window facing the field. You drink warm milk. You wait. You do not fear the bells anymore, not like you once did. Now you feel a strange comfort in them, because they mean someone is still trying, that somehow through the thickness of soil and silence the human will to be heard endures. Sometimes it's a false ring, a string blown by wind, a fox brushing past, but sometimes it's not. Once you answered a bell just after midnight. When you dug, you found a girl no older than 12. Her eyes were open, calm. She didn't scream. She just blinked at you. Quiet. When asked later what it had felt like, she only whispered, like being wrapped in clouds. She never feared death again. Even centuries later, these fears lived on. In Victorian England, decades after the medieval world had passed, the idea of premature burial still haunted imaginations. Writers penned stories of men scratching madly at wooden lids, of air running out, of muffled screams in darkness. But they weren't imagining it from nothing. They were remembering the bells, the watchers, the ones who listened. And even today, deep beneath the ivy in overgrown cemeteries across Europe, you can still find them, a rusted frame, a frayed cord, a small silent bell, waiting just in case. Settle in again now. Let yourself rest fully into the mattress, into the warmth of the blankets around you. Let the soft hush of the night wrap around your arms, your legs, your chest, until even your breathing feels like it belongs to the dark. There is nothing to hold on to now. Let go of the edges of thought and fall into the deep center of stillness where imagination gently opens and stories breathe without effort. Let's return now not to fear, but to understanding, to that quiet medieval certainty that death could be mistaken, and that those who watched over the grave were not morbid, but merciful. In the year 1457, a small village near the edge of what we now call Switzerland recorded the passing of a young herbalist. She had lived in the woods, gathering foxglove and angelica root, and often treated villagers when no priest or wise woman would dare. When she fell ill-stricken by a sudden fever that took her breath in hours, they buried her without ceremony. No bell was tied to her wrist. No one kept vigil. Only a shallow grave hurried during a rainstorm that turned the soil to black sludge. 3 days later, a hunter walking the edge of the woods claimed he saw a pale figure standing between the trees, clothed in torn linen, staring with eyes that held neither terror nor peace. He ran. When he returned with others, the grave was found broken open from within, the lid of the coffin shattered upward. Her body was never found. Some believed she had risen, as a revenant, a wandering soul. Others whispered she had simply been not dead enough. Stories like hers gave rise to what some called the 3-day rule. Before burial, families were encouraged by monks, by midwives, even by their own neighbors, to leave the body untouched for 3 days. They were to light candles, speak prayers aloud, and observe. Even the untrained eye could sometimes see a flutter of movement, a change in the complexion, a breath so soft it would vanish if you blinked. The dead were not to be hurried into the earth, lest they claw their way back again. In larger towns, this rule was formalized. Corpses were placed in stone crypts with small slits carved into the wall's vents. They were called, but their true purpose was often to allow sound to escape. A moan, a cry, a bell tied to the toe, whatever might rise. In Paris, it was once noted that during a particularly cruel winter 4 individuals were saved from live burial, this way woken by the bell, as faint ringing through the snow-thickened air, dug up by grave watchers with trembling hands and wide eyes. All 4 lived. One later became a monk. Another left the city entirely, never to return. It was said he feared even the sound of a church bell for the rest of his days. And still, people buried. They had no choice. Death came so quickly, sometimes silently, that it was impossible to tell who had crossed the line and who merely lingered near it. You must understand the world as it was, dark halls warmed only by the glow of firelight, beds made of straw, and homes full of stale air, people falling ill in the night and laid out before morning. In such a world, there were no machines to confirm a heartbeat, no mirrors fogged with breath, only the silence and the hope that it wasn't final. Imagine now you were one of those grave watchers. You lived behind the chapel in a small stone hut no wider than your outstretched arms. Your duties are simple and sacred. Each night you walk the path between graves, checking the bells, the cords, the soil. You listen, you wait, you keep a log by candlelight of every chime, even those mistaken by wind or bird or squirrel. And sometimes rarely, but truly you hear it. That soft ting in the night, delicate as a teardrop on glass. You rise, heart slow but steady, and dig without question. You do not panic. You do not call for help. You simply dig, because you've made a promise to those who cannot speak for themselves. One night, a heavy mist clings to the headstones. Your lantern flickers as you kneel beside a newly filled grave. The bell above it trembles, soundless for now, but swaying just enough to catch your eye. You press your palm to the earth, feel the faintest vibration. You begin to dig. The soil is cold, heavy with recent rain. You work in silence, breath steady, shovel scraping against stone and root. When your blade strikes wood, you drop to your knees and begin clearing by hand. Then you hear it. A sound from inside, not a scream. A gasp. A long, hollow gasp of someone starved for air. You pry the lid loose and open it gently. Inside is a boy, perhaps 13, his face pale but alive, his fingers curled upward as if still dreaming. He looks at you, startled but not afraid, and for a moment both of you simply breathe. That night you write in your log, buried Wednesday, woke Friday, saved. Nothing more, because this is your work, your quiet, holy work. As your breath slows again and your body eases further into softness, let the rhythm of the past settle around you like mist gathering along ancient walls. You are not rushing forward. You are not moving at all. You are listening gently with the part of your mind that dreams in stillness. The story continues, not as something told, but as something remembered, something buried, and now gently uncovered. The bell log grows longer with each passing year. Some entries are ordinary, quiet, frost on all stones, no movement. Watched until Copro. Others are marked with care. Fate ring near midnight, bell 5. Cord tot dug. False alarm mouse nest beside root. But then, there are the ones underlined. The sacred ones. The rescues. Bell for rang at secondar. Girl, age unknown, returned. Eyes open. Breathing shallow. Cradle dug beside birch. Saved, you keep the ink well fed. You keep your notes neat. You know these words may one day outlive you. There is a rhythm to it all. Life in the graveyard is quiet, but it is not lifeless. In the morning, dew collects along the bell cords like silver beads. In the evenings, foxes cry in the hills beyond the chapel wall, their voices thin and high and wild. You sip your tea. You watch the horizon. The dead do not frighten you anymore. What frightens you now is silence. Not the kind that rests, but the kind that forgets. The kind of silence that doesn't listen anymore. One evening, long after the year's first snow, you are joined by a visitor. A traveling friar, on pilgrimage to a nearby shrine, arrives late and seeks shelter. He asks if he might spend the night in your watch hut, as no one's will take him after dark. You offer him a blanket and a stool, and together you sit with the door cracked open, watching the moon climb slow through thin clouds. He asks you quietly whether the bells still ring. You nod. You tell him, fewer than before, but yes, sometimes. He asks what it feels like when one rings. You pause for a long while before answering. It feels, you say softly, like someone remembering they are alive. The friar does not respond, not right away. Then he says that he heard a story in his youth, from an abbess who once buried a nun too soon. They dug her up 3 days later alive, but altered. She would not take food, nor speak, nor enter the chapel again. She spent her remaining years wandering the garden barefoot, staring at the birds. They said she could no longer bear the sound of prayers, because she had prayed beneath the earth, and no one had answered. You and the friar sit in silence. After that, neither of you says a word for nearly an hour. Just the crackle of the candle between you, just the sigh of the wind against the stone wall, just the faint creak of a bell swaying, somewhere out in the dark. The next morning, the friar is gone, left before dawn as pilgrims often do. But you remember his story, and that night, when you write in your log, you pause before the page. You dip your quill in ink, then hesitate. Finally, you write, night passed quietly, bell slept, story told, I listened. You think sometimes about your own burial, not out of fear, but out of curiosity. You've prepared everything, of course. You've already tied your own wrist cord, tested the bell. Your grave lies behind the chapel, near the stone bench where the old headmistress sits in memory. You've arranged for the local apprentice to keep watch when your time comes. He's only 17 now. He still flinches when owls cry. But he has kind eyes. And he listens. What more can you ask? Not to live forever, not to escape death, only to be heard just once, just in case. You've seen the worst of it, after all. The forgotten graves, the ones dug too fast or without care. You once uncovered a coffin so warped by water that the lid had collapsed inward, inside. The body was turned face down, arms bent backward, the wood scratched raw from within. She had tried. No one had been there to listen. You sat with that grave long after the body had been moved. You lit 3 candles, one for her name, and one for her bell that had never been strung. You hummed softly, though you didn't know a proper song. And the wind moved through the trees like breath. That night, you dreamed she was walking again, barefoot, eyes forward, not angry, just finished. Tonight, the fog comes early, rolling in like breath across the ground. settling low and soft along the crooked fence that marks the edge of the cemetery. The trees vanish into it, their trunks dissolving like fading memories, and even your hands look pale and distant in the lantern glow. This is the kind of night where the boundaries between the living and the dead feel thinner, softened by silence and dampness and the hush of falling mist. You breathe in deeply, letting that chill air enter your chest and slow everything down. And still, the bells sleep. You sit on the old stone bench near the row of elder graves, your cloak wrapped around your knees, the logbook open across your lap. You have kept this vigil now for nearly 30 years. Your hands are lined, your fingers ink-stained, your voice quieted by time. The graveyard is changed, grown. New stones rise where grass once lay flat, but your job has not changed. Each night, you check the chords. You count the bells. You wait. It is not a task people notice, not one they thank you for, but there are names in your book, names who lived because you were listening. That is enough. Tonight, you recall the woman they called the midwife of the dead. A legend, perhaps, but one passed from village to village about a woman who had been buried once, then dug up alive, and afterward spent her life returning the favor. She was said to walk barefoot in graveyards under the full moon, listening for bells. They said she carried a small iron shovel and a lantern of blue glass, and that she never spoke a word. But when she walked past a grave and the bell rang, she would dig without question, even if the others refused. When asked why, it was said she would press a finger to her own lips, and then her chest, then point at the earth. She had no voice, but her meaning was clear. I remember. You never knew if she was real. But stories like hers shaped your quiet faith in the work. It was never about superstition. It was about mercy. It was about patience. It was about keeping the line open, just in case someone somewhere was still knocking from the other side. As you rise and make your round, your lantern light dances over the newer graves, those with little brass bells still untarnished by rain. You pause beside one and test the cord. It's taut, well tied. The earth has settled evenly. But you linger a moment, your hand resting on the cool stone, whispering the name carved there. You always do. It is your way of reminding them and yourself that someone is still here, still watching, still willing to listen. There was a time, early in your watchkeeping years, when a bell rang during a thunderstorm. It was a sharp, panicked sound high, and sudden and unmistakable. You had to dig through mud, soaked to the bone, rain running into your eyes, thunder shaking the sky overhead. When you reached the coffin, the lid had already cracked from within. A man's voice rose up like a gasp, then a sob. He had been buried just hours earlier. It had taken less than a single evening to mistake deep sleep for death. He survived, moved to a distant town, wrote you a letter once every year, until he died decades later, for real this time. His last letters simply read, "You gave me back a lifetime. Thank you." You keep his letters in the bottom drawer of your desk, beneath the old maps and ink pots and spare candle stubs. Sometimes when sleep won't come, you read them in the dark, and in the quiet you remember that to keep watch is to keep hope. The bells don't always ring, of course. Sometimes there is no warning, no sound, just regret, found too late. You recall a boy no more than 10 buried without a cord, because his family could not afford the bell. His grave was sealed quickly during a fever outbreak. When the villagers exhumed nearby soil to move another body, they found his coffin disturbed. The lid cracked. His arms bent awkwardly. No one spoke for days. You left the bell there anyway, mounted it above the empty stone, and carved his name into a new marker. And though you know he will never ring it, you still check the cord, every night, just the same. You pass the watch house now, the tiny hut of rough timber and stacked stone that has kept your vigil warm in winter, dry in rain, safe from wild dogs and colder things. Inside the candle is low. You refill the oil. You sip from a cup of broth. You read your notes one last time, then close the book and listen. That is how the night ends now, always in listening. Not for footsteps, not for voices, just for bells, tiny bells, ringing through soil, ringing through silence, calling back from beneath the earth, and reminding the world that sometimes death makes mistakes. The fire in your little watch house has grown low now, glowing faintly like a heart still beating beneath a chest of ash. Outside, the world has hushed, every bird gone to roost, every window shuttered, every breath of wind resting its tired wings. You step out once more, just as you always do, lantern in hand, to walk among the sleepers. The bells hang silent in the mist, like tiny metal moons suspended in fog. You are not afraid. You have never feared the dark. What you fear, what you have always feared, is forgetting, letting the world become too loud to hear the softest voices. So you listen, and tonight the silence is complete. But the past is never truly still. It hums just beneath the surface of the present, like old roots beneath the frost. And as you walk between the graves, your thoughts drift again to the city of Lubeck, far to the north, where a mass burial in the 1500s once gave rise to a chilling discovery. As the legend goes, a child was buried in a family crypt after a sudden seizure. The priest, a cautious man, insisted on a waiting period, but the father overruled him. The child was laid to rest. When the crypt was opened decades later during repairs, the family found scratch marks on the inner lid of the small coffin. But that wasn't what haunted them. What haunted them was the tiny wooden figure the child had carved a doll from the inside wall of the coffin, using his own fingernails. It was sitting beside him, upright, watching the door. Whether that tale is true or not, you have learned that stories like bells don't need to be loud to ring true. Fear doesn't need to scream, it only needs to echo. And in those echoes are the reasons you keep watch. Because every one of these stones has a name, a story. And some of those stories didn't end when the earth closed in. Not all bells were hung with care. In some places, especially during plagues, they were forgotten altogether. Mass graves wide, shallow, hastily dug held dozens, sometimes hundreds of bodies. No markers, no cords, no watchers. But in one region of Bavaria, the people did something different. They planted lilac bushes above their plague pits, not bells, but blooming markers. Every spring the scent would rise from the earth and remind the living of what lay below. Some say the dead stirred then not in sorrow, but in peace, blanketed by roots and flowers and sunlight filtering down between green leaves. In time it became custom, a gesture of gentleness, a silent answer to the silence. Tonight, as your feet return to the elder graves, you pause beside one of the oldest markers, its carving half faded, the name illegible, but the bell still intact. It has not rung in over 40 years. Still, You kneel beside it as you always do. You run your fingers along the string, test the tension, and rest your hand over the soil. Just for a moment, just in case. You close your eyes and let the cold seep into your palm. And there it is, not a sound, not a movement, but a presence. As though the earth beneath you is breathing in time with your own lungs. Not trying to rise, but trying to remember. You whisper then, not out of fear or duty, but reverence. I hear you. And maybe that's all they ever wanted. Maybe that's all anyone wants in the end, to be heard. Not only when alive, but after, when the world grows quiet and the door is closing. To know that someone is listening, that their name will not be erased, that the bell is still strung and the sky still watches over their sleep. And now you return to the watch house once more, your steps slow, your lantern's glow dimming into a low golden pulse. You close the door gently behind you and sit once more by the candle. You record the night's final entry. The page is nearly filled, but you write with steady hand, all bells at rest, fog thick, soil undisturbed, no dreams below. And then, for yourself in the margin, smaller and quieter, still listening, you place the book back on its shelf. You stretch out on your cot. The wool blanket feels heavier tonight, or perhaps it is simply the weight of time. As your eyelids lower and your breath evens into the rhythm of sleep, you wonder, if you were buried tonight, would your bell ring? Would someone be there to hear it? But then you smile because you already know the answer. You train them, the watchers who will come after. You passed the bell, the log, the shovel. You taught them how to hear the silence, how to feel for movement and stillness, how to honor the pause between life and death. And so, with peace in your chest and quiet around your heart, you let the world grow dim. The candle burns low. The bell cords sway slightly in the breeze outside, but no sound breaks the stillness. Only the breath of the earth. Only the memory of those saved. Only the gentle, ever-present promise. Someone is listening. Sleep drapes over the world like a thick woolen cloak now, soft and heavy, stitched with the silence of old stories and the slow, deliberate rhythm of night. Outside your little watch house, the mist has lifted slightly, revealing the gentle curve of headstones under moonlight, some leaning, some broken, some smoothed by centuries of rain. You listen to the wind as it threads through the grass, and everything feels ancient, but kind. It is in this soft hour, when the edges blur between breath and dream, that you remember one of the oldest tales your mother told you when you were still young enough to fall asleep by the hearth. It was the story of the second breath, a belief held by many during the early 1300s in isolated villages of what is now northern Italy. They believed the soul hovered near the body for 3 days after death, reluctant to leave. If the soul found no breath, no light, no warmth, it moved on. But if, during that window, the lungs stirred just once more, the second breath could call the soul back. That's what the watchers were for, not merely to guard the body, but to offer light, warmth, and human presence, in case the soul was searching for a reason to return. It was said that people who were buried too soon could not find their way back, not because they lacked breath, but because they were surrounded by earth and silence. That story stayed with you, and it is why, all these years later, you still light 2 candles when a new grave is filled, one for the body and one for the soul. Not because you fear ghosts or curses, but because you understand the power of small things, warmth, sound attention. Bells are only part of it. The true mercy is simply being there. There is another story, one written in a crumbling letter kept in a monastery's archives outside Bruges. It speaks of a girl named Alide who fell into a deep, unresponsive sleep after tending plague victims. She was presumed dead, no visible breath, no movement, and buried behind the convent chapel. But a nun named Marguerite, who had watched over Alide every night for weeks, refused to believe she was gone. She claimed she had seen her hand twitch in the candlelight. She pleaded with the abbess to delay the burial, but the risk of contagion was too high. Alide was laid in the ground. Marguerite broke convent law that night. She returned with a spade, alone, and dug through the half-frozen soil by moonlight. She found the girl alive barely and carried her back in silence. Alide lived. Marguerite was never punished. In fact, the abbess is said to have declared that Marguerite had wrestled one soul back from God with nothing but breath and love. In the convent that followed, they changed their burial practices. They strung bells. They waited. One small act had rewritten how death was met. And this is the quiet truth that runs like a stream beneath the world of the watchers, beneath your life, and now gently beneath your dreams, that every bell is more than metal, every chord more than string. They are hope in its smallest, most fragile form. They are reminders that even when we are still, someone might be listening. Even when the breath disappears, it might yet return. You rise once more, drawn by instinct, and step into the night. A breeze lifts the edge of your cloak. Your lantern is nearly spent, the light within it flickering low and orange, like a sun falling beneath the edge of sleep. You approach one of the newer graves, a child's. The bell tied above it is smaller, delicate, almost toy-like. You kneel, brush the frost from the marker, and speak their name aloud. A name written in your log, a name you will remember even after the grave is covered in moss. You listen. You place your fingers lightly on the cord. No movement, no sound, but still you wait. Because silence, you've learned, is not absence. It's patience. It's possibility. And then, from somewhere deep in the folds of the earth, a memory surfaces. A rescue from long ago. One you haven't thought of in years. An old woman presumed dead after collapsing in her garden. Her family mourned quickly, quietly, her life long and gentle, her passing expected. But as you passed her grave 3 nights later, you paused. There was no reason, no sound, no motion, just a feeling. You dug, slowly, not even certain why. But when you reached her, you found her eyes open, unfocused, but blinking. Alive. She held your hand as you pulled her free. She didn't speak for a full day afterward. And then, softly, she whispered, "I had the most beautiful dream." But it wasn't finished. That is why you still listen, because sometimes a dream isn't finished. The world has grown completely still now, wrapped in the hush of deep night. Even the crickets have ceased their chorus, and the trees creak only faintly in the breeze like old wood, shifting in sleep. The stars overhead are thick, layered like frost across dark velvet, and you look up at them from the edge of the graveyard path, watching the way they shimmer between the bare branches. Their silence is not empty. It is a kind of listening, a stillness that holds memory, that holds breath. It reminds you that silence, too, has a voice. Inside the watch house, your candle is burned to its final stub, a tiny amber glow pressed against a tide of shadow. You light a new one slowly, the wax hissing softly as the wick catches, and the warmth from the flame seems to breathe outward like a sigh of comfort. With the fresh candle lit, you turn back to your logbook. You thumb through pages worn smooth by time and fingers, pausing at one entry in particular. A night 15 winters ago. You remember it not for what happened, but for what nearly did. That evening the bell had rung not loud, not even twice. Just once, a single soft chime, like a coin tapped gently against stone. It had come from an older grave, one dug before your time, but still carefully marked and watched. You grabbed your lantern, your spade, your breath, and you ran. When you arrived, the bell no longer moved. The cord lay slack, and for a long moment you questioned what you'd heard, but you dug anyway. That was always the rule. Trust the bell, even when it doubts itself. When you reached the coffin, it was undisturbed. The wood dry, the lid sealed, but still, you opened it. Inside lay a woman whose features had not changed, still as you expected, breathless, cold. But in the upper corner of the coffin lid, a mark, a scratch, tiny, barely more than a crease in the wood, but fresh. You touched it, you stared at it, and you understood. Someone had moved, briefly. Someone had stirred just long enough to try. You sat beside that open grave for over an hour, the coffin laid bare in the moonlight, wondering if perhaps she had been alive at first, only to fade before the bell could ring again. It haunted you for weeks, and from that night forward you began checking the bells 3 times each evening. Not once, not twice, but 3, just in case one rang only once. It was around that time that you began carving your own set of tools. You didn't trust the newer cords being made in town. They frayed too quickly, pulled loose in rain. So you twisted your own rope, braided it tight from wool and flax. You sanded and shaped your own bell handles, each fitted to sit in the hand just right, each tested to chime at the softest pull. They weren't loud, but they were honest, and when they rang, you knew it. You kept these tools in a wooden chest beneath your cot, wrapped in oilcloth, sacred in their silence. Only a few people knew of them. The apprentice, of course, who now shadows your steps, and the monk who brings bread once a week, but no one else. They are not tools for show. They are for salvation. Quiet salvation, the kind no one sees, the kind that leaves no statue or monument, only names still breathing in the world. One of those names was Jonah, a boy of 19, buried during a fever outbreak that struck fast and strange. He had collapsed in the market square, convulsed once, and gone still. The priest marked him as taken. His family wept, but hurried the burial. You strung the bell yourself. That night, just past midnight, it rang 3 times. Not sharply, not in panic, but steady, deliberate. You remember running so fast your lantern fell and shattered. You dug in darkness, bare hands cutting through brambles and frozen earth. When you opened the coffin, Jonah blinked at you, dazed. He said only one word, waited. Then he wept. He became your apprentice years later, and tonight he walks beside you now, full-grown, thoughtful, quiet like you. He doesn't speak much, but he listens well, and he understands the gravity of silence. You look at him, and you see the future of this work, the calm endurance, the patient heart, the eyes that never rush past a grave without seeing more than stone. He's already saved 3. His name will be written in new ledgers long after yours is shelved. And perhaps one day someone will carve his story into the lid of a chest or ring a bell in his memory, but not yet. Tonight he's beside you, and tonight no bells ring, but you both wait. The two of you stand side by side now, still and quiet, beneath a silver-washed sky. There's something about sharing the silence that gives it weight, a reverence. You do not speak, and neither does he. Yet something passes between you and the stillness, a mutual understanding that what you are doing, this act of keeping watch, of waiting and listening, is more than a task. It is a covenant, a quiet promise made not only to the dead, but to all who live in fear of being forgotten. You each understand that fear intimately, and so you guard against it not with swords, not with shields, but with ears attuned to the faintest chime. You lead him through the rows of stones, your lantern swaying gently, casting elongated shadows across the dew-slicked grass. Every so often you stop to test a cord, feeling a subtle resistance, checking the bell for frost or rust. He does the same, carefully, almost ceremonially. His hands move with the kind of patience that cannot be taught, only learned through time and humility. He kneels at one grave, his fingers brushing away a fallen leaf from a small stone marker, and you can see in the tilt of his head that he's thinking not about the work, but about the person buried there. That's how you know he's ready. The world around you is growing softer with each passing minute. The moon has begun its slow descent, dipping toward the hills beyond the woods, and the air feels denser, heavier, as if the night itself is beginning to settle. Far in the distance, a lone owl calls once, then is silent. You turn back toward the watch house, but before you reach it, you pause beside the stone you carved yourself your own future resting place. The ground is firm here, the grass trimmed. The bell you prepared hangs motionless, strung with a cord you wove many winters ago. It is not fear that keeps you returning to it, but reassurance. You are not afraid to be buried. You are only afraid to be buried unheard. And this bell, this simple tether between what lies above and what lies beneath, gives you peace. You and Jonah sit again beneath the watch-house awning, sipping warmed cider from clay mugs. The horizon is beginning to pale with the faintest thread of morning, and the long dark is lifting. This is always the hour of memory, when the past feels closest, when the names in the logbook hum just beneath the skin. You recall a woman who once left you a letter delivered months after she had been saved from burial. She had been mistaken for dead after a drowning, and the cold had slowed her heart to a crawl. You dug her out yourself. She had no words then, but years later she sent you a folded note on linen paper. It read simply, "I dreamed I was buried inside a song, and someone sang me out of it." You keep that letter tucked between the back pages of your log. Tonight you show it to Jonah. He reads it twice, silently, then folds it again with care and returns it without speaking. You know he understands that to dig, to listen, to wait is its own kind of music, a lullaby for the almost lost, a rescue measured not in noise but in presence. As dawn approaches, a faint bell tower chimes from the village chapel, far beyond the hill. Not a grave bell, just the morning hour rung softly for the waking monks. But still it echoes through the field, and for a moment both of you pause to listen. You let it wash over the stones, ripple across the cold soil, touch every name carved into wood and granite. and though you know its tone has nothing to do with your vigil, you nod toward it, murmuring, "They deserve to hear it, too." Jonah nods. "Yes," he says, voice quiet but steady. "All of them." You smile. It is not often you do, but this feels like a good moment to let it rise. The day is nearly here now. Pale blue has begun to unspool across the eastern sky, and the birds are starting to wake. Your vigil ends soon, and yet the work never really finishes. The next night will come, and the one after. There will always be graves. There will always be bells. And you know deep in your chest, in the stillest part of your heart, that there will always be someone to hear them. You return to the watch house, open the logbook one last time before sleep, and write the night's final entry. The same words you've written more times than you can count, but which never lose their weight. All bells at rest, no sound from below. Silence holds, we remain, and beneath it just one more line. Jonah checked the child's grave, held the cord like it was a hand. You close the book, blow out the candle, and as you lie back on your cot, letting the quiet fill your lungs, you think about every soul you've ever brought back to light, every name you've helped carry forward, and in that silence, gentle, weightless, complete, you rest. The days have grown shorter now. The sun rises slow and cold, and each evening the shadows stretch longer across the moss-soft ground. It is late autumn, the season of thin veils and long sighs, when the warmth of firelight matters more than ever, and every grave seems to sleep a little deeper. The trees above the cemetery shed the last of their leaves like old parchment falling from forgotten books, and the bells, those quiet, patient guardians, hang still among bare branches and stone. This is the time of year when the villagers tell stories again. Around hearths and in low tones they speak of the watchers, of the cords, of the ones who came back. You hear your name sometimes, not in praise, but in reverence, not loudly, just enough to know the work is remembered. Jonah now does the rounds in your place more often. His steps are steady, his shoulders broader than they once were, his face composed in the same way yours once was when you were younger, alert, but calm. He has learned to walk slowly through the fog, to pause at each bell, to speak the names carved into every stone with the same quiet care you once offered. And tonight you watch him from the watch-house window, sipping warm broth from a wooden bowl, the candle flickering behind you like a drowsy eye. He checks the cords just as you taught him, twice, not once. Pulls gently, tests the tension. You feel a quiet pride rising in your chest. Not the loud kind, not the swelling, thundering pride of stories, but the kind that hums beneath your ribs like a second heartbeat. A pride you don't need to speak aloud to feel. He returns after an hour and sets the logbook down beside you. "Nothing stirred," he says, shrugging off his cloak. "A fox at the fence. One bell shifted with the wind, but I checked the soil. All still." You nod. That's enough. The work is not glamorous. It is not even noticed most nights. But it matters. You write down his words carefully, your script slower than it once was, but still neat. Then, before closing the book, you turn to one of the early pages years ago now and run your finger along the name Alide, the girl rescued by Marguerite. You wrote her story in the back of the book, along with others, so it would never vanish. Not into smoke, not into silence. That night, as you prepare to rest, Jonah asks you a question. "Have you ever—" He begins, then pauses. You wait. You always give space to unfinished thoughts. Have you ever heard a bell ring and not answered it? The question lands gently, but it doesn't drift away. It sinks. And you know what he means. You think for a long moment before answering. Once you say, your voice soft, many years ago, during a storm. I thought it was wind. It only rang once. I didn't dig. I told myself it was nothing. I didn't check. Jonah says nothing. Neither do you for a long while. The next morning, you continue quietly. The cord was snapped, the earth disturbed. The coffin lid cracked from the inside. You pause. There was nothing I could do then. Jonah looks at you, eyes filled with something between understanding and mourning. That's why you dig, even if it's just a twitch of the string. You nod, even if there's no sound, even if no one else believes. That's why we dig. The fire crackles in the hearth. Outside, the wind sighs through the stones. And together you sit in the glow, not needing to say anything more. Later that night, while the stars watch silently from their place above the hills, you dream. It's not the same as your other dreams. This one is clear. You are in the graveyard, but it is not nighttime. It's not even the graveyard as it is now. It is greener, wilder, filled with bluebells and rust-colored ivy. The bells above the graves are not made of metal, but carved from bone and silver. They sway in windless air, and as you walk between them, you see the faces of those you saved. Alida, Jonah, the boy named Elias, the drowned woman who dreamed in song. They don't speak, but they smile. They nod to you as you pass, their forms soft at the edges, their presence warm. And then you see her, the one whose bell you ignored. She says nothing, only walks beside you for a while, then places a hand on your shoulder, and you wake. You lie in the dark of the watch house, listening to the breeze brush the door. The room smells of ash and wool and the faint, sharp scent of cold air. And for the first time in many years, your eyes sting, not from smoke, but from sorrow. You sit up. You light a fresh candle, and you write her name in the back of the book. You never knew it, but you write it anyway, for the one I missed. I hear you now. The candle burns low in the quiet of the watch house, its flame quivering slightly in the draft that slips through the old stone walls. You sit in stillness, the logbook closed, your hands resting gently in your lap. The night stretches long outside, and though your bones ache more than they used to, you feel no urge to sleep. Tonight is not for rest. Tonight is for remembering. There's something sacred about these hours, when time seems to move more slowly, when your thoughts become soft-edged, and the veil between past and present feels almost transparent. You listen to the wind as it curls around the corners of the chapel, and you feel a sensation you haven't known in years, not fear, but readiness, a kind of acceptance. Something is drawing near. You rise and wrap your cloak around your shoulders. The weight is familiar, comforting. You take your lantern and step outside into the hush of the graveyard once more. The air is damp and still. Fog pools low between the headstones, and the trees stand like tall, watching sentinels. The bells above the graves are still as silver pendulums. You begin your rounds, walking the same path you've walked thousands of times. Each grave is familiar, each name known. You touch the chords gently, feel the cold metal of each bell. They do not ring, but they do not need to. Their presence is enough. Their silence means peace. As you walk, your thoughts return to your younger years, to the beginning of all this, how the work came to you, not through inheritance or obligation, but through calling. You had once been a carpenter's apprentice, shaping wood for doors and cradles, not coffins. But then came the fever that swept through your village, taking your sister first, then your father, then nearly your mother. She was declared dead, wrapped in linen and laid in a cart beside others. You remember how her chest had looked still, her lips pale, but you couldn't shake the feeling that she was not gone. So you followed the gravedigger. You waited until dusk, and you dug. When you opened the shroud, her eyes blinked against the lantern light. She lived 10 more years, and from that moment on, you knew someone had to stay behind and listen. You reach the elder graves now, where the oldest bells hang, their cords knotted with years of weather, their frames rusted but still intact. You pause at your own future grave. The stone is simple. The bell above it is polished, checked weekly by Jonah. You smile faintly. There is comfort in knowing the traditions will outlive you, that someone will still tend the cords, warm the bell frames with cloth, whisper names into the dawn. Your hand rests on the string tied above your marker. It is strong, secure. You pull gently. The bell does not ring. Not yet. As you make your way back to the watch house, you see a light burning inside. Jonah is there. He looks up as you return, his face calm, alert. He doesn't ask where you've been. He doesn't need to. He offers you a cup of warm tea, and the two of you sit by the small fire in easy silence. Eventually, he speaks. Will you teach me to make the cords the old way? You nod. And the logbook, will I write it differently? Again, you shake your head. You'll write what you hear. You say softly, what you feel. He nods, and that's enough. He doesn't need a lecture. He's already listening. The night draws near its end. Soon the sky will blush with the first touch of pale light, and the birds will begin their song. You feel it now deep inside, the slow, peaceful weight of sleep pressing closer. Not exhaustion, not weariness, something else, something final. You write your last entry in the log, your hand steady. Bells at peace, ground unbroken, Jonah ready. Then, below it, you add a final line. I am finished. You hand Jonah the logbook. He accepts it with both hands, and for a long moment, neither of you speaks. You meet his eyes. You nod. The torch crackles behind you. The night holds still, waiting. He sets the book gently on the table. Then he stands, and together for one last time you walk the path between graves. The dawn is a whisper, soft and silver at the edge of the world, a slow unfurling light that brushes the tops of the trees and seeps gently into the folds of mist lying low across the cemetery. You and Jonah walk together along the stone path, past bell ropes strung with dew, past headstones tilted by time, past the markers you carved by hand long ago when your fingers were younger and your nights stretched endlessly ahead. There is a stillness to this final walk that feels sacred. You do not speak. You do not need to. The rhythm of your steps, the creak of the cords in the faint breeze, and the soft hush of breath between you say everything that must be said. You pause once more at your own resting place. The bell above it does not sway. The string is taut, tied with the same knot you have used your entire life. You place your hand against the headstone, smooth now from seasons of wind and rain, and let it rest there. You don't feel fear. You don't feel sadness. Only a sense of return. like closing the final page of a beloved story. Jonah stands beside you, his head bowed slightly. He doesn't speak either, but his presence is steady, warm. In him you see continuity. In him you see the cord will never go slack. The sun is rising now. It spills amber light over the hills and paints the stones in shades of gold and rust. The graveyard is silent, but not empty. You feel every life you've saved walking with you now. Their memories live here, not just in the book, not just in your mind, but in the soil itself, in the quiet kindness of a grave tended with care, in the stillness of a bell that never had to ring. You turn to Jonah and place the brass key to the watch house in his hand. He closes his fingers around it with reverence. "I'll keep them safe," he says. "I know," you reply. You walk back one final time, the earth soft beneath your feet. The air is crisp now, the chill of night lifting, the breath of morning sweet with pine and ash. Inside the watch house, you lower yourself onto the cot. The blanket is folded neatly. The candle is still burning, but only barely. Its flame dances low, like a sigh preparing to settle. You look around this space-humble, sturdy beloved. Every stone, every worn surface, every curl of smoke feels like it belongs to you. Or perhaps you belong to it. Jonah lingers in the doorway. You nod to him, a gesture that means you may go. And he does, stepping out into the golden light, beginning his first full day alone. The torch has passed. The bell is in good hands. You lie back slowly, your head sinking into the softness of the pillow. Your breath deepens, slows. The fire crackles beside you in gentle rhythm. And in this moment, you are not worried about what comes next. You are not wondering if you'll wake, because in the world you've built, if your breath should fail, if your heart should slow too long, someone will be there, listening. Outside, the wind stirs the smallest bell. It doesn't ring, but it moves just enough to catch the morning light, just enough to glint like a wink from something ancient and knowing. And all across the graveyard the bells hang quiet in their frames, their cords strong, their watchers waiting. Sleep now. Rest in the hush of earned silence. You are not forgotten. You are not alone. If you are ever buried too soon, the bell will ring, and someone will come, because you were there for them, and now they will be there for you. The candle flickers once more, then fades, and the bell waits.